Alright guys, so this is the start of our congruent triangle unit, and we will cover this over the rest of the semester. And the very last day of the semester we will have a test on this, so this is it. This isn't the easiest unit, so please make sure you're actively participating and doing your worksheets as you should be. Do them when you're supposed to do them, don't get behind. Make sure you watch the Edpuzzle videos, make sure you fill out the stuff that goes in your interactive student notebook and things like that. All right, so the first thing in your interactive student notebook is this triangle hints page number 1. And these are just some hints that you will use throughout that'll really help you. As you do more of these, things will start jumping out at you. And these 4 things we're going to do, 2 on this page, 2 on the next, are really things that you should start seeing first thing. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about is the reflexive side. Okay, now I also want to note that there's such thing as a reflexive angle as well. Okay, so a reflexive side is when 2 triangles share a side. Or reflexive angle is when they would share an angle. Okay, so if I look at this picture down here, I see triangle PSR, okay, and I also see triangle PQR. Okay, now when I see these, I notice that this right here, they share this side. This side is a part of both triangles. So anytime that happens, I put an X through it. And so therefore we can say that PR is congruent to PR. Now remember when we did this back in chapter 2, the reflexive is the exact same thing on both sides. Now there is a little bit of a difference, and I'll show you within the next one, and it will make a big difference as we go, but for now just know that it's when they share a side or an angle. All right, so if I look over at the second diagram, I see 2 triangles. I see this triangle here that I'm going to highlight. And if you have highlighters, I highly recommend you use them this section. If you don't, I highly recommend you get some because we will do full-fledged proofs and the highlighter is very important. All right, so once again, when I highlight these, I see that they share this side here. Okay, so this would be, we could use the reflexive to say that FH is congruent to FH. Okay, now as we go through, sometimes remember that FH is the same thing as HF. There's going to be sometimes we're going to write it this way too. It's still the same side, it's just written in a different order. And after we get into proofs, we'll talk about why we would do that and when we would do that. All right, so another big hint that you're going to use a lot are vertical angles, and more specifically, the vertical angle congruence theorem, okay? Because remember, the vertical angle congruence theorem tells us that all vertical angles are congruent. But let's think back to chapter 2, this might actually be in chapter 1, and define what vertical angles are. So vertical angles, remember, are just opposite angles when 2 lines are crossed. So when I say vertical angles, if 2 lines are crossed, this angle here and this angle here would be vertical angles. And remember, they're congruent. Or I could also say that this angle and this angle are congruent. They're opposite of each other when the lines are crossed. All right, so if I have a diagram like this, my vertical angles, of course, that would be this angle and this angle. And I could say that angle WXV is congruent to angle YXZ. Anytime you have vertical angles, you know they're congruent. Okay, and then same here, angle DEB, which would be this angle here, and angle is congruent to angle ABC. All right, so let's look at the triangle hints page number 2. All All right, now we're talking about the midpoint. Remember the midpoint is the point in the exact middle. And what the midpoint tells us is that it separates it into two congruent parts. Okay, so anytime something tells you that there's a midpoint, you should be thinking two congruent segments. All right, so on this first one, it says E is the midpoint of KW. So E is the midpoint of KW. Okay, so that means E is in the exact middle of K and W. And so therefore, I know that KE is congruent to WE. Okay, now do this one on your own where it says D is the midpoint of MT. So do that one on your own real quick. All right, so if D is the midpoint of MT, then that means that MD has to be congruent to DT. All right, last but not least, let's look at angle bisector. So an angle bisector, this bisects an angle, or it, we can say that it divides an angle into two congruent angles. So it cuts an angle directly in half, making there two congruent angles. So if I look here, I can say that AD, and AD is right here, AD is the angle bisector of angle BAC. Okay, well that should tell you that this angle here and this angle here are congruent. So I can say that angle BAD is congruent to angle CAD. Now go ahead and do this one over here on your own. All right, so DC bisects angle ACB, so that would tell you that angle 1 and angle 2 are congruent. All right, so your homework is the worksheet number 1, and I'm going to do the first couple with you to kind of tell you what I expect. So if you look at your worksheet and you read the directions, it says highlight the parts of the picture that are mentioned in the given. So once again, I prefer this be done with a highlighter if you have a highlighter. If you don't, colored pencils will do it, colored pens, pencil and pen, but highlighters really make it pop out and make you see. Okay, so we're going to highlight the parts in the given. And then we're going to mark the pictures with what you can conclude. So are angles congruent? If so, make congruent markings on angles. Are segments congruent? If so, make congruent markings on the segment. And then we're going to state what we can conclude. So if we look at 1, I'm given that XM bisects angle ZXY. Okay, so XM bisects is my keyword here. Bisects angle ZXY. Okay, so just like we had discussed, when something bisects an angle, it cuts that angle into two equal parts. So I can tell you, sorry, my pen disappeared. I can tell you that this angle here is congruent to this angle here. So I've highlighted it, I've marked it. Now I need to write it out. So angle YXM is congruent to angle ZXM. And that is all you'd need to do for that one. All right, let's look at number 2. Okay, so it says RM, which is right here, is perpendicular to TU, which is right here. Okay, and the key here is this is the symbol for perpendicular. So you have to ask yourself, what does it mean to be perpendicular? Well, if you recall, when two things are perpendicular, that means they cross at a 90-degree angle. So I can say that angle 1, angle 2, angle 3, and angle 4 are all right angles. Okay, so I've highlighted it, I've marked it with the squares, and now I've written it. All right, so to do example 3, it tells me that N, which is right here, point N, is the midpoint of AB. Okay, so that tells me that if it's the midpoint, like we had just discussed, it cuts it into 2 equal parts. So I'm going to mark the 2 segments that are congruent, and then I'm going to write it out. AN is congruent to BN, and that's it. All right, so let's look at this one, and this one's a little more tricky. The next two both are. So I'm given that AC, which is right here, and BD, which is right here, bisects each other. Okay, so if I were to write that in words, that means AC bisects BD and BD bisects AC. That's what bisects each other means. They both bisect the other part. Okay, which tells me that this piece and this piece are congruent, and this piece and this piece are congruent. So I really have multiple things here. I know that DO is congruent to BO, and I also know that AO is congruent to CO. Okay, and that's what I can conclude from this one. All right, this is the last one I'm going to do with you, and then you can do the remainder of them on your own. So I'm given that SV is the perpendicular bisector. So I'm going to look at this as 2 different things. Perpendicular bisector of PQ. Okay, so I want to ask myself, what do each of these words mean? So this perpendicular means it cuts it into a 90-degree angle. And bisector means it cuts it into 2 congruent parts. Okay, so if this, let's look at perpendicular first, is perpendicular to PQ, that means this angle here and this angle here are both right angles. So I can say angle PVS and angle QVS are right angles. Okay, now I want to look at this bisector part. Okay, so if it bisects PQ, that means that this piece here and this piece here are congruent. So I can write and PV is congruent to QV. So there's 2 separate parts. The perpendicular tells us one thing, the bisector tells us another. All right, so I've done the first 5 with you. There's 16 total, so you can do the last few on your own. Hopefully this won't take you very long.